Hello. This is a video that's intended to give you an introduction to Chinatown, 1974 film, the screenplay for which was written by Robert Towne. The film really did come primarily from Towne's screenplay. Towne had noticed by looking at some old photographs of Los Angeles that there were a lot of places in the city, or some places in the city, that were relatively unchanged since the 1930s and 40s. In other words, he looked around and realized that really the place looked pretty much like it did some 30 or 40 years before. This gave him the idea of a detective story that might be set in that location. He began writing the screenplay. Was also inspired by old scandal from about 1908 in Los Angeles called the Owens Valley land grab scandal. This is a famous scandal that had to do with how water became incorporated into the Owens Valley, making that land, which was initially very unprofitable, more or less useless land, into very fertile and very productive and therefore very profitable land if you could bring water to it. They bought that land for very cheap, the scandal, and then turned around and made sure that they were able to irrigate that land by having the city build an aqueduct, basically, to take the water out there. So at the taxpayers' expense, this land was turned into very profitable land. If you've had broccoli recently, there's a good chance it's from Owens Valley. It's still highly, highly fertile and productive land that more or less was made so by ripping off the people of Los Angeles. This is a critical part of the plot of what happens in Chinatown. Inspired by that and by detective stories like The Maltese Falcon, Towne wrote his screenplay. Robert Towne was friends with Jack Nicholson. Jack Nicholson and Towne were both friends with two key players, Robert Evans, who was a producer in Hollywood, and Roman Polanski, who was a director in Hollywood. Evans, Towne, and Nicholson decided that they wanted to produce and have Nicholson star in and have Polanski direct this story, which was originally called Water and Power. Water and Power. This is a good title. It's not as good as Chinatown in a lot of ways. There was only one problem, and that was that in order to convince Roman Polanski to direct, they were going to have to convince him to come back to America. Polanski had left America a few years before, about 4 years before, because in 1968 or 1969, his wife was murdered in what are now known as the Tate LaBianca murders, or the Charles Manson massacre. You've probably heard of Charles Manson. You know that he was a cult leader who convinced some of his disciples to go over to Sharon Tate's home, the ranch, La Cielo Ranch, I believe it is, in Los Angeles, and murder her and several other people in these horrible, horrible crimes. Sharon Tate, who was pregnant with Roman Polanski's child at the time, was stabbed to death, stabbed 41 times, so on and so forth, the horrific crimes. Some related individuals, the LaBiancas, the gang left Tate's ranch and went up to the LaBiancas and murdered both of them. In their home, again, horrific crimes. You probably heard of Charles Manson and Helter Skelter. Helter Skelter is one of the things that they wrote on the wall of Tate's ranch in blood. And because of this, of course, Polanski was devastated. And he left. He had been producing movies and directing movies, in Hollywood for some time and had made some great movies. He left Hollywood and went to Europe and had vowed he would never return. So Town and Evans and Nicholson had to convince Roman Polanski to come back to direct this movie. Had to be shot in L.A. That was an important, critical part of the story. In fact, driving the plot to a great degree. And they did convince Polanski to come back. That had some implications for the screenplay. For example, the original ending, which I don't want to tell you too much about, but was quite different from what Polanski decided had to be the ending, which was a much more tragic one. And in part, he realized that that ending was the one that was appropriate for what he knew about what happened to people in Hollywood. And so that was something that had quite a significant impact on how the movie turns out in the end. It was Polanski's experiences with Sharon Tate and the Tate Bianca murders. Polanski's run into a lot of trouble since then. It turns out he slept with a 13-year-old. It was a huge scandal, and he's still not officially allowed back in this country. He's continued to make films, some even Oscar-winning films, but he's more or less barred from the country. He has been back. I believe one time he was allowed to come back, but for the most part, he's not allowed to come into the country. This is an important backdrop for what happens in the story of Chinatown, the film. One of the things that's greatest genius for this film is the fact that it has two plots. We don't know what the relationship between those plots are. We're not sure really what the two plots are. On the surface, it appears to be the story of the murder of Evelyn Mulray's husband. And it is, of course, that story, but it's much more than that. Part of what has to happen in the case when you have two plots is you have to decide how to resolve and interweave those two plots. So which one of those plots in the detective story is going to get resolved first? And which one will be the second one? So how do they relate to each other, and how is that going to get resolved in terms of how you reveal information in the screenplay? Detective stories, like other stories, but especially in detective stories, are all about when and how you release information about who done it and information about their motives, why they might have done it, etc. So that's a critical challenge in writing the screenplay for Chinatown, was to figure out how to set up and maintain this relationship between these two critical plots. Now, for Chinatown, this is one of the most fascinating things about the film, and one of its more genius moments in terms of how the film works out and how it works on audiences. Well, having said that, it's important to keep in mind that Jack Nicholson had been acting in some pretty significant parts up to this point, but he hadn't been the kind of romantic lead that he would turn out to be in this film. And this is not a romantic film, but it certainly has romance in it to a certain degree. Now, Nicholson had played a variety of roles, but he'd also starred in a lot of motorcycle movies that were more or less cheap B kinds of films, genre films, motorcycle gangs, etc. So he's groomed in a different way for a different kind of leading man roles in films that would follow Chinatown. Of course, he's an actor who can do anything and act in any variety of different parts, different styles. So he is paired with Faye Dunaway, who is also a huge mega Hollywood star. She plays Evelyn Mulray, who is our quasi-femme fatale for the film. We'll have to talk about whether or not and how she might fit the category of femme fatale. She's certainly the love interest for our hard-boiled detective, who is named Jake Gittes. Jake Gittes. Now, interestingly, one of the important parts in the film is played by John Huston. John Huston, of course, is the director of The Maltese Falcon. And he was also an actor, and he played a great villain in Chinatown. His gravelly voice and kind of rough demeanor, perfect for this character. Excuse me. That's important for several different reasons. One of them is that, the most important one is that on the set of Chinatown, you have the director of one of the greatest noir films of all time, The Maltese Falcon. Someone who understands these stories and someone who understands how to tell them and how to make them exciting and interesting. You'll see, as you watch Chinatown, a lot of carryover from Chinatown to, or from Maltese Falcon to Chinatown. Most notably, you'll see that the ending is very much modeled after what happens in the Maltese Falcon. It's fascinating stuff, and you can just imagine that you've got this great actor and great director on the set of your film, and he's helping you to make your neo-noir or retro-noir film. It brings us to thinking about retro-noir, and retro-noir is simply this: it's contemporary noir films that are made or set in an earlier period when noir originated. And so this is a 1974 film, but it's about the 30s in Los Angeles. Now, the Los Angeles is also a major character in the film. The city itself is important. All location shots, all real places that you can go to. Very few backlots. Interiors, of course, are not locations typically. But everything else is pretty much Los Angeles and has the feel of Los Angeles. And that's always pretty gritty and grimy. It's pretty hardcore stuff. The story is structured around a few different comparisons or might say, correspondences. Again, two plots, and a great emphasis is placed in the film on seeing and perceiving, and follows a theme that is familiar from in all of film noir, and that is that things are not as they seem. So you think you're seeing one thing, but you're actually seeing something else. You think you're hearing something, but actually you're hearing something quite different. And you can't always tell what's going on. And this is what Jake Gittes tells Evelyn Mulray when she says, well, what was so wrong, what was so bad about working as a police officer, as Jake Gittes had? What was so bad about working as a police officer in Chinatown? And he says, well, you couldn't always tell what was going on. And so the lieutenant told them, do as little as possible. Don't do anything. Which meant it's not the best way to police, but it was the only option they really had. So, interestingly, again, the film is called Chinatown. It did not have, as it neared completion, it did not have a scene that took place in Chinatown. Although Asian American characters are certainly represented to that point, they are represented in somewhat stereotypical ways, not in the most positive ways. And this is, if the film does have a problem, it would have to do with that representation of Chinatown and of Asian American characters. They had to set something or have some more direct relevance to Chinatown, and so they had Jake Gittes be a police officer who had formerly worked in Chinatown, and they had to have some other kind of scene that was situated there. And so as it turns out, they did finally find a way to incorporate Chinatown for real in a significant and important way at the end of the film. That gets us started thinking a little bit about our hardboiled detective story and our femme fatale in Chinatown. Also want to bear in mind that this is a film made in 1974, just before Hollywood turns its attention to making blockbuster films. So this is just before Jaws comes out and Star Wars, and in those circumstances, of course, Hollywood began to make all of its investment in the blockbuster film and everything that goes with that. All the promotions, all the Halloween costumes, lunchboxes, watches, coloring books, all those kinds of things that go along with the blockbuster films. Hollywood began making many fewer films, but they ended up pouring a lot more money into a few or a handful of blockbusters. Chinatown's not a movie that's made that way. It's conceived of as not necessarily a smaller movie because it has high-powered actors that star in it and a high-powered director. It's not low budget in the way that we sometimes think about film noir. And it's more or less made the way that films used to be made in Hollywood. So there's some nostalgia that attaches to this, and it really has a somewhat romantic quality to it. So it is a sort of throwback to an older Hollywood. It's in that period. Doesn't have anything to do with actors or acting or filmmaking. That doesn't come up directly, but certainly it is a kind of film that made in a different way, produced in a different way by friends, etc. Film is great for all that, and of course it has tremendous resources at its disposal. You will want to pay attention to landscapes and settings. You'll also want to pay attention, as I said before, to anything having to do with looking or seeing or perceiving, and anything having to do with misperception especially. What could go wrong in looking at something, thinking, listening to something? How can our senses deceive us in some ways? I hope you enjoyed Chinatown. I'll tell you more about its personal significance for me as we come to class and get started tomorrow, or most likely as we end up our conversations about Chinatown. I'll try to reserve time to tell you about that a little bit. Otherwise, this should get you going pretty well for thinking about this film. It is a magnificent film, incredibly beautiful, well made, gorgeous. Most of it shot in the magic hour, time just before, just after sunrise, sunset, respectively. Gorgeous, beautiful structure to it, and beautiful in terms of its metaphorical structure and the ideas, metaphors that hold it together. You want to be thinking about how the two plots relate to each other once you figure out what the two plots are. Just kind of exciting and fun too for thinking about the movie. I hope you enjoy Chinatown, and we will, of course, begin there and concentrate our attention on that. We'll talk some about cinematography tomorrow, but mostly we'll focus ourselves on Chinatown. All right, and in the famous words of the film, forget it, Jake. It's Chinatown.